In the 1800s, they didn't have a real strong understanding of how human beings worked. And then by the end of the 1800s, they start to develop the behavioral conditioning techniques of Pavlov and going
Pavlov.
into the 20s with Skinner and Watson. And by the 30s, these eugenics, Fabian socialist people, they got some ideas. They want to do some experiments. They want to learn more, but they have boundaries. So they experiment ideas from Cold Spring Harbor, Long Island, make their way over to a young Adolf Hitler and his group of National Socialists, where these Western bankers are pouring in money. That's why we had a Great Depression here. American finance was going over there. Why? Because their economy got crushed after the Treaty of Versailles and these penalties. So it was
Mhm.
really easy to go in and buy all the infrastructure, right? So they have armaments, they have arming with philosophy and scientific eugenic knowledge of making a pure race and all that type of stuff. And afterwards, those people who funded those projects, they bring it back, but they know they have to rebrand it because Hitler gave it a bad
That's
name.
it.
That's what they did with the Nazis. That was
Yeah.
National Socialism. The Russians are international communism,
Yes.
and the
Right.
Chinese are a mix of communism and capitalism. And they have slave labor, but they have like communist or capitalism at the top, but they have communism for everyone else. And it's like
Right.
another experiment. And the idea was you surround America with these types, and then you can change our attitudes, values, behaviors, and beliefs through the schooling system generation by generation. And they did that. And that's what Charlotte Iserbyt and
Right.
Porter Sargent and John Taylor Gatto and a whole bunch of people pointed out slowly over time. There's like more and more evidence to that. And they definitely did. And you check their documents, like the Rockefeller Foundation, what they did in the 50s and they were doing back then with the Ford Foundation, like they're in with the Vatican and inclusive capitalism right now and the
Right.
Rothschild family. So they've all
Yes.
decloaked. They've said, we're working. Here's the agenda. And they just hope that they have enough wind in their sails that they can just get to the finish line without any opposition. Yeah, and when you look at it, the history fleshes out how the robber barons who provided like the railroad infrastructure in Europe and in America, they get done. They get
Yeah.
done at a certain point, and they go over and they outfit Russia pre-Soviet Union, they outfit China pre-communist revolution there. So the Western industrialists are behind those two communist experiments, and the purpose always was this is how they're eventually going to take over America. They can have this other that they control and influence from behind the scenes and have there's a whole lot of information to that, right down to Kim Philby. So T.H. Huxley was an acolyte of Darwin, and then T.H. Huxley mentored H.G. Wells. H.G.
Mhm.
Wells mentored Aldous Huxley, and Aldous Huxley was a mentor at one point to George Orwell. So there is a chain of continuity between the Fabian socialists, and H.G. Wells had said he was in their meetings and he's in these
Mhm.
roundtable group meetings and things like that that he says in his books and his experiment on biography or autobiography, the 2 volume set. He talks
Yeah.
about that stuff in there. So they're the Fabian socialists, the wolves in sheep clothing, that idea is still present today with Klaus Schwab
Mhm.
and the continuity of power that has led from the beginning of the 20th century all the way till now. It's a small finite planet. There's only so many people working on these things, and they're made themselves known to those who will look it up and read about it, but they're not
Yeah.
going to tell you on TV.
Yeah, I mean, you go back to 1970, and it's not Brzezinski that invents the idea of technocracy. As you know, this goes back to Plato. It goes
Mhm.
back to the ancient Greeks. They had the idea of quantification and a kind of mathematical regimentation of all of society into these
Well, it's
rigid
good to run
structures.
armies. Look how the Romans built roads and did all that good civilizing around the world because they were able to figure out how to feed people on the road. Say that I don't recommend everyone read that book or read that book first, at least. It's 1,200 pages or so, depending on if you have a reprint, there's a couple bootlegs out there, have different page numbers. But essentially, there's a lot of words in there to hide what he's actually telling you on very few pages throughout the book. So, a better place to start is Joe Plummer's Tragedy and Hope 101, or a book like Lord Milner's Second War and Sean Stone's New World Order, A Strategy of Imperialism, which is, you can get the Kindle of it, but it's way sold out. And then the Anglo-American Establishment. So let's start with Quigley and the Anglo-American Establishment, which is the first book he wrote in 1948, and it was the last book he published. It was published posthumously in 1981 by Stephen Zarlinga, who also wrote The Lost Science of Money. So Quigley gets this he gets a whistleblower from inside Cecil Rhodes' secret society, this guy Alfred Zimmern, and he gets the story and he doesn't publish it. He doesn't know what to do with it. But what he does for the next 20 years is he goes and studies and verifies all this stuff that Zimmern had said. So he had a manuscript in 1948, the Anglo-American Establishment, and he knew if he published it, it would end his career and possibly his life. So he didn't want to put it out. And that's why upon his death, it was published. So 20 years later, after he's in the archives of the Council on Foreign Relations and he has like the Anglo-American establishment's own records, he writes this big, thick book in 1966 called Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time. And it goes out there, everybody's buying it, it sells out. And then he's told, and there's interesting references to how he's told. He's told that the book has no demand and there's not going to be a second printing. Really, what Macmillan Publishing did was destroyed the printing plates so they couldn't make a second publishing. Rudy Maxa is a New York Times reporter in 1976. He interviews Dr. Carroll Quigley, who was a professor at Georgetown's Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service. So he trained diplomats, he trained spies, he trained people like Bill Clinton, who was a Rhodes Scholar. Quigley himself was mentored by a Rhodes Scholar, and these are all people in the vein of Cecil Rhodes who want to bring America back into the opium-dealing British Empire. So that's the main goal. So Quigley writes this book, he gets it out there, they censor it, they tell him, and he says in the interview that they lied to him. So that's a conspiracy right there. The people that Quigley's working with, they lied to him, you know, and then they asked about Lionel Curtis, who's a main figure in Anglo-American establishment. And that's where Quigley says, we can't talk about him, we'd lose our career or worse. And he says, turn off the tape recorder. And the end of the meeting happened. That's what the end of the interview. I think that like when I read pages, like it was 50 and 52, where he's talking about Montague Norman, the Bank of England, the Rothschild family, that's where it became real for me, is when I saw it in Tragedy and Hope. Because before then it was just like an internet rumor. Yeah, and I was like, I went to 5 years of a good university, and if they existed, I would have known. I read the Wall Street Journal. Somebody would have told me along the way, but no. And then there's a deep history to that family, and so I started acquiring their biographies and autobiographies, and then started reading into that history that we don't know about.
Game of Nations. Probably a lot of people didn't read Soldiers of Reason. Probably a lot of people didn't read, Kessler's Ghost in the Machine. Anything like that you think would be like, if you were to say, like, what are the key? We know about Tragedy and Hope. We know about Anglo-American establishment. What do I need to be aware of?
All right. So what you need to be aware of is, once upon a time, America fought against Britain, and we separated. And then they had a plan that they tried to take us back in 1812 and burn the White House, and that didn't work militarily. And then slowly during the 1800s, they go and focus on subjugating India and China with the opium trade. And then they come back over here in the 20th century, and they refocus from Conan Doyle coming up with the idea and publishing it, to Cecil Rhodes codifying it and leaving a last will and testament to fund, bringing America back into the British Empire and creating the Rhodes Scholars and other various groups. Like the Pilgrim Society was a legacy group, the Council on Foreign Relations, Bilderberg, Trilateral, World Economic Forum. They're all working groups in that same, what you were just saying. And so they were playing something traditionally called the Great Game. And then that was with the German royal family, the Russian royal family, they're cousins basically. But then they wore them all out through World War I, no more of them. So they got to get strong with their, ex-cousin, their sibling, or however you want to describe it, America. That's the new Great Game. That's where guys like Miles Copeland come in, because he's part of the OSS turned CIA. And all they did was British intelligence led the Americans around by the nose. And they're like, here's how to do everything. And they were masters of spycraft. And they mastered that, not in the 20th century, but in the 1700s and 1800s with the East India Company and the Rhodes Diamonds guys, and those types of kind of black market outside of the spectrum of fairness and law and jurisdiction. It was just pillage and plunder and slavery, and those types of things were giving them a lot of power behind the scenes. So when you get into how did OSS get created, how did CIA get created, and you get a whole bunch of documents, and some of these things say that like Ian Fleming helped to draw up the blueprints for the CIA, and it was like that close. I know that Camp David used to be an assassination training camp. I know that Fleming and these guys went to Camp X, which was assassination training camp over the border in Canada. They were acting against Americans during wartime. So the special relationship and all that entails, the destroyers for bases, and basically in the 20s after World War I, they did a lot of changing our history books to make it more pro-British and British friendly. And that was like the Hands Across America movement. And that's what the Pilgrim Society and those groups were trying to do to ameliorate themselves to America. And they changed their name to a Commonwealth, so it wasn't an empire anymore. They got this Commonwealth, and that was, I think, Lionel Curtis Columbia
I know
lectures.
Curtis, exactly.
Yeah,
The Commonwealth of God.
yeah, exactly. So any of the books in that area that start to help illustrate, but the guy William Stevenson, this guy here, he was the top British spy in America, running guys like Wild Bill Donovan. So the creation, and his name's probably not even really William Stevenson, because he had a dark. So just like Wild Bill Donovan he had like a whole bunch of different families and names, and he was a pretty out there dude. He wasn't your average human being going around doing that type of spycraft. Same thing with Stevenson, the man they called Intrepid. And they were housed in Rockefeller Center. They were put up there by Nelson Rockefeller. So like the Anglo-American establishment was together on that whole thing.
Yeah, right. But that's the thing. And that's the thing that Quigley talks about in that middle. No, actually it's the chapter on FDR. That was one of the most enlightening chapters, where Quigley says that they had figured out that you can do this two-step move every like decade or so, the elite bankers, where on the one hand, you move things towards privatization and freedom, and that allows the economic energy and surplus and profit to open up for 10 years. Then you can move the market then you step it over into communism, and that transfers the wealth to the centralized elite. And so you do this two-step move back and forth, bust, boom, cycle. And he says it's manipulated and engineered.
Yeah, it's like pistons firing in an engine, and it's like sowing seed and then reaping harvest, and that's what they're using people for, basically. They're tricking people out of their life, in ways that people can't even imagine, because you spent 15,000 hours forgetting all the stuff that you knew when you were 5 and would have naturally flourished had you not been indoctrinated. And they want you to not ever have a chance to make your own decisions, have the opportunity to say yes to the things you want and say no to the things you don't want. And a lot of times it deals with knowledge and having money on hand to do those things.